Okay, so let's go through some of your faith journey because obviously that's shaping how you're seeing the world in terms of your fiction writing, and you have a pretty interesting faith journey. Obviously, you and I ended up in very separate places, but you started off. You're born into a Jewish family. I've said to you before, we've had this conversation, but you were born into an extraordinarily secular Jewish family.
Right.
So and now obviously you're a religious Christian. So how do you get from point A to point B?
Well, the weird thing about my family was that it was secular, but it was also committed to. My father, at least, was committed to the traditions. So we went to Hebrew school. We were bar mitzvahed. We learned this stuff. But it did occur to me that I've always had this, I won't call it an obsession, that's a little too much, but I've always had this idea that things should make sense. That if things don't make sense, you should change your mind. And part of that was because of a kind of dysfunctional atmosphere in my house where we were taught a lot of philosophical ideas that were just untrue. And it's very damaging, because you don't want to tear away from your family, but at the same time you want to find the truth. And so I became kind of obsessed with finding the truth. So you're there praying, and you're there learning Hebrew, which is not my language, and you're there wearing, the hat and the thing, and you're thinking, well, if there's no God, and my mother was a stone atheist, and my father was just kind of like, he didn't want to get in trouble with God, but like he didn't exactly believe in him either. And after a while, you start to think, well, this is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. So after my bar mitzvah, that was kind of the turning point. I was bar mitzvahed. I got thousands of dollars worth of gifts that I put in this box. And one day I got up and threw the box away because with everything in it. And I just thought this
like
is
the old lady at the end of Titanic.
Yeah, this is exactly. This is ill-gotten gains. This is not what I wanted. And I expected to live my life as a sort of intellectual agnostic, like the way, I think this kind of was the default position of thinking men in my day, and it's kind of still is.
Still now, exactly.
Yeah,
I'm doing this routine now, yeah.
Right, and I think that was going to be it. That was really my position, which is very flattering to the intellectual mind because you can analyze everything into dust. You can just, no matter how small the point is, you can break it up into even smaller pieces. Because you don't have that bottom line of there has to be meaning, there has to be morality, The problem was, when I was 19, I read Crime and Punishment, and it convinced me that the moral world existed. It convinced me that Kant was right. There was the starry sky above and the moral law within, and that was undeniably true. And because of that, I kept circling around, well, where does this morality and meaning come from? And I wasn't satisfied with things I hear from guys like our pal Jordan Peterson, the Italian philosopher Marcello Pera, says, live as if there were a God. And I think to live as if there were a God is essentially to want the conclusions of a syllogism whose premises you don't accept.
Right.
And
That's right.
It just makes no sense. And so, again, everything had to make sense to me. And ultimately, I had, when I was a kid, I've lived like these two lives. I had terrible emotional problems because I had a terrible relationship with my father. My household was dysfunctional in this very invisible way. There was not a lot of violence. There was not a lot of hatred. It was just this kind of invisible dysfunction. And so I cracked up. There came a point when I was like 28 years old. I just stopped working, basically. I just went, boom, something's wrong. And at that point, which would have been the smart point to seize hold of God like a piece of driftwood floating by in the ocean, I thought then I'll never believe because it'll always be this thing I did because I was weak, because I was down on my luck, because I was broken. It'll always be this crutch that I seized hold of. It just shows you how stubborn I was about things making sense, And so instead, by the grace of God, I found a shrink who cured me. And I always laugh about this. I'm the only person I've ever known who was cured by psychiatry. But he did, within the course of like 2-3 years of talking to this guy, I was a completely different human being. And it was only then when I felt sane, when I felt certain that my impressions were correct, when I felt certain that I was not living a delusional life, that it seemed obvious to me that there was a God because of my moral stance. And the stance that if everybody on earth, there was a time when everybody on earth believed that slavery was right. Even the slaves, they would have said, yeah, I don't want to be the slave, but this is the way things are. At that time, slavery was wrong. And once you say that, you're screwed God-wise. You cannot get away from the idea that somewhere there is this moral base, this base of meaning. And this is the thing that's become fascinating to me now, because there are guys like you and me who actually believe, but we're kind of anomalies in the world of the thinking man. I think there is right now, the world of the thinking man is divided by into two. On one side, you have people like Jordan Peterson, Marcelo Perez, Douglas Perry, who wrote that book, The Strange Death of Europe, and Houellebecq, the novelist we were talking about, Houellebecq, who are basically saying the West can't survive without the Judeo-Christian thesis. We should all ascribe to the Judeo-Christian thesis. I myself do not believe.
Right.
They're all saying the same thing. I myself cannot believe. On the other side, you have these guys like Yuval Harari and who wrote *Sapiens* and Steven Pinker, who are saying, no, my friend. We are going up and up and up. This has been an absolute.
Well, give it to Harari. I think that Harari is at least more intellectually honest than Pinker. I mean, I think that Pinker does this whole routine where the Enlightenment will save us and everything is going to continuously get better, and you can carve away the foundations of Western civilization, nothing will crumble. And Harari is basically like, well, maybe civilization sucked in the first place, right? Maybe if we just go back to living in fields and we were happier when we were eating grass and all this kind of stuff. And at least he's honest that way.
And he has this kind of Vulcan idea that we're all living in a delusion. Like the problem with him is he says the most unique, his phrase, I would never say the most unique, but he does. He says the most unique thing about *Sapiens* is the fictions we create. So we have a fiction that there's a God. We have a fiction that we have human rights. We have a fiction of money. Money has no value. But that's not how fiction works. I mean, fiction describes something. It does not create things. I can create a delusional world through fiction, but good fiction it describes reality. So money is a good example. Money describes the value of something to a human being when he has a lot of it or when he doesn't have a lot of it. That's what it describes. It actually does have a value that we're accepting. The paper doesn't, but the idea does. And because Harari is a Vulcan who doesn't accept that there is a human life that matters, he thinks it's all being created by the fictions, but the fictions are being created by that internal life.